Today, I want to talk about the pipeline from fairy-loving kid to romantasy-loving adult, because it can't be just me who grew up loving fairies, having fairy rings, reading fairy books, to now being obsessed with book talk, romantasy, all of the above. And if we've not met before, I'm Rose Confetti. I make videos from my cute little pastel office. And yeah, today I just want to pay homage. I want to give some love to all the fairies that we've met along the way and how that led up to a love of romantasy. And full disclosure, this will definitely represent my experience as like an Australian late 20s, nearly 30s woman, and the media and the books that I consumed. So it's not going to reflect everyone's experience, but that does mean I would love it if you could put your favorite fairy memories down in the comments. I'd love to know what books started your obsession, and as an adult, if there's a romantasy book that changed your world. So in the 90s, I was a toddler, and that is absolutely where my love of fairies began. In particular, I have a core memory of this specific book, and I'm really interested to know if for anyone else this is the first fairy book that you like really latched onto, because it's a weird one. It's Lady Cottington's Pressed Fairy Book. Now, this book is simultaneously nightmare fuel and like delightful and beautiful. It's this book that basically follows this young girl who like squashes fairies into whatever she's carrying, and it all sits in her diary, and it's just like pages and pages of squashed fairies in her book. It is somewhat gruesome, but they are also somewhat beautiful, and it's this like fun discovery of the fairies that this girl has found. I'm gonna be honest, I don't have that book on me, so I couldn't read through the plot, but that is how I remember it. I don't know, maybe it's something else entirely, but that is how I remember it, and that's how it like lives on for me. Interestingly, when I looked up the book, it turns out the author was a member of Monty Python. Really makes sense with the humor. And the illustrator worked on Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, which makes so much sense when you look at the artworks. But what really set the blueprint for fairies for me was Shirley Barber. And Shirley Barber was such an icon. It is so unsurprising that people now are still discovering her art and absolutely loving it. Since the 80s, she's made like over 30 fairy books, and some of these artworks are just like burnt into my memory. They are what a fairy is. That ethereal quality, the pastel colors, the beautiful hair, the butterflies, the wings, all of it is fairy to me. So that was really fundamental for me at that time in the 90s, really like shaping what I thought fairies would be. I thought they'd be living in flowers. I thought they'd be like beautiful little creatures hanging out with butterflies and like sitting in flowers, that whole lovely, sparkly world. And that kind of opinion of fairies and that visual of fairies continued until I was probably like in primary school. And at this point in the early 2000s, I don't know whether it was me getting older, so I was just consuming different content, or if it was what was popular at the time, but fairies kind of became more pop-like, a little bit more tween-friendly, a bit more everyday girl vibes, a bit more like a normal kid, I suppose. And this in particular, for me, is reflected in the Rainbow Magic books. This series came out in the 2000s, and they were so popular. They probably are still popular today. I just remember the original like Rainbow Fairies, and then we've had so many spin-offs since. And I definitely do remember, like I have a younger sister, and I remember her bringing home the books, and I remember thinking, how many fairies are these people going to come up with? There are so many. And when I was looking them up for this video, I need to tell you some of the fairy titles I found that really made me laugh. There was Mia, the bridesmaid fairy. Holly, specifically, not the party fairy, but the party fun fairy. And then there's Tasha, the tap dancing fairy, which as someone who watches Drag Race, all I could think about was how Tasha, the tap dancing fairy, should have been Susie Toots' character on Snatch Game. Maybe she should have done it. She should have done it. But regardless, these books were like super popular with girls in the early 2000s. And yeah, they kind of made fairies a little bit more like us. On the flip side though, in Australia at this time, we had a TV show called The Fairies. And when I tell you these women had like my dream job, they were like these women who'd like dance and dress up as fairies. It was a pretty standard kids show. It came out in around 2005, which in hindsight, in 2005, I would have been 10. This show feels like it was pitched at much younger children, but I was loving it. I was still really enjoying fairies, and I don't blame myself. Like, these outfits are so cute. And actually, speaking of dream jobs, like classic kid just being like, I just want to be around fairies all day, every day for my job. Did anyone else grow up with like a local fairy shop? Like a couple of towns over from mine, we would have this shop where it was like full of crystals and like fairy trinkets, and they always smelled like incense. And sometimes they'd do like birthday parties there. Do they still exist, little fairy shops? Because like maybe that needs to be something I do with my free time, is revisit a fairy shop, but with the money that I have as an adult rather than, pocket money as a kid. Anyway, as we get towards the late 2000s, 2010s, this is where I go into high school, and I have to say this is probably the lowest point for my love of fairies, which is kind of sad, but there's a pretty good reason for that. I was a teenager at that time, so it probably wasn't that cool to be admitting that I liked fairies. But you know what else was happening was Twilight came out. So I feel like as I became a teenager and I was reading like romance novels, fairies weren't around. However, vampires, werewolves, all of that was around. And if you were in high school when these books were coming out, it was such a good time to be reading these books. Like, we didn't know what was going to happen next. I was like into the books before the movie came out. Do you know how cool that was for me as a teenager? I felt so cool. And it was just a really exciting time. And although they weren't fae, I do think the idea of the romance interest in these books being a multiple 100-year-old vampire, a bit like Buffy actually, or a werewolf, probably prepared me for my love of romantasy going forward. So yeah, during this time, less about fairies, more about vampires and werewolves. However, a few fairies did slip through. At this time, I remember reading some of my first graphic novels, which was the Witch series. I don't actually know if these characters were fairies. They had wings, and their outfits, fantastic. I think I remember trying to dress up as them once. And these books did have magical elements, so I'm going to count it in the influential fairy book. And this is where we get as well some really strong female protagonists, which absolutely is something that I still look for today in romantasy books. Speaking of outfits, I have to mention Winx Club. I loved this cartoon. I watched it with my sister. These outfits were everything. And when Cat's Eye dressed up as them for Halloween, I died. It was just so good. To be honest with you, a lot of these shows probably came out at much different times to what I'm describing. It's just that for me in Australia, sometimes we would get shows like airing much later than other parts of the world. And on top of that, like, I kind of just watched what my sister was watching at the time. And so unless we discovered something on free-to-air TV or at the DVD shop, we just might have been late to the game. So apologies if this doesn't line up with your memory of the shows, but this is just like what I experienced. And for any millennials out there, you're correct. I have not mentioned Fairytopia just yet. I do remember watching the Barbie fairy movies, and I think I remember having like the Fairytopia dolls. However, I would argue I don't think those movies were fundamental in building my love of romantasy. Like, that for me sits in a different section. Lovely, delightful, gorgeous, charming. But they don't like contribute to my lifelong love of fairies and romantasy, I don't think. However, something I think that did contribute to my love of romantasy that's like slightly adjacent to fairies is all of those dystopian novels, those young adult dystopian novels that came out in the 2010s. Like, I was in high school when The Hunger Games came out, and the impact that that book series had on myself and other readers at the time was just huge. I think it's like the strong female protagonist, the good versus evil, the stakes are really high. Although there's no magic, it's like a similar world to ours, but fully exaggerated. And there's love triangles, there's twists, there's turns, your heart gets broken. So I just think all of that probably contributed to romantasy later on. Then as we get to the mid 2010s, I was at university, and to be honest with you, I was just not reading. I fully went into the like, I'm studying, I'm having fun with friends, I don't have that much time for reading. And this continues for quite a while, right up until pretty much like COVID-ish time, when a friend, like so many other people, recommends ACOTAR to me. And I know lots of people don't like A Court of Thorns and Roses, they don't like these kinds of series. However, for me, it felt like opening up that world of magic again, which is such a nice feeling. Like, obviously, the content is hugely different. There is no comparison between the fairies of childhood to the fae in these books. However, the feeling of like this world opening up and it taking over your imagination is a really special feeling that I think just makes me nostalgic for being a kid and like actually believing in fairies. Particularly with Sarah J. Maas's books, the fact that there's like multiverse and so many books, and when you start reading them and you fall in love with the characters, there's just so much to explore and it's so much fun. And for anyone out there who is in that stage where you're not actually reading right now but you kind of want to give it a go, I do usually recommend Throne of Glass because the author Sarah J. Maas was like quite young when she wrote the first few novels. They read a bit more like YA, and if that was the last time you read a fantasy book, it's a great place to start. It's one of my favorite series of all time. Like by the time you get to the end, it's phenomenal. But what's extra good about it is as you read it and you get more comfortable reading, she grows as an author, so the world expands. And so it's like paced in a really nice way for you to get into. And the most recent romantasy book that I read, the third installment of like the Emily Wilde series, it made me almost, I don't know, nostalgic for that first fairy book, the pressed fairy book, because obviously they are very different. The content, the audience, everything, that's all very, very different. But the protagonist in Emily Wilde herself, is an academic and she's like studying fairies and she's taking observations. And so there was something about that energy, and then thinking about the pressed fairy book where this girl is like trying to collect all the fairies, where I was like, I don't know, there's like a link there somewhere. At least in my brain as I like prepare for this video. But that's probably another good recommendation if you're trying to get back into fantasy again, is that Emily Wilde series, just because the way that it's written to be like this academic's journal and the detail in it to get to the point where there's footnotes that describes different types of fairies, like all of that is a really delightful way to get back into fantasy. And especially when the main character is seeing fairies as other, it can kind of like help you be like, yeah, it's weird, but like I'm on board with it, if you know what I mean. Anyway, as we come to the end of this video, I have to say, I don't think there is necessarily a pipeline from loving fairies as a kid to loving romantasy as an adult. But for those of us who have held both hobbies, I just think it's really special that in this age of book talk and romantasy books becoming really popular, you know, say what you want about the quality or, you know, stuff being overhyped. Is it not fun that as adults we get to embrace like magic and imagination and like exploring these new worlds and like talking about them online? I just think all of that's really wholesome and really special. And so with that in mind, please let me know your romantasy recommendations in the comments below. I would love to know what to read next because I am entering a bit of a reading slump. Also, how weird is that? The idea that reading a book that you love makes you not want to pick up another one. That's kind of weird and counterintuitive. Anyway, let me know any book recommendations down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe, like, etc. I don't know what I'll be back doing next week. We'll just have to find out. Bye.